Imagine this: a vast British Empire, powerful armies, naval dominance, control over land stretching across the globe. And yet, throughout history, there were two small groups that kept Britain awake at night: the Irish and the Scots. They weren't mighty empires. They didn't have vast wealth, but they had something far more dangerous: an unbreakable spirit. For centuries, the British crown feared the Irish and the Scots, not just because of war, but because of what they represented: resistance, rebellion, and the refusal to be conquered. This is the untold story of why Britain feared them for hundreds of years. So stay with us until the end of this video as we uncover the courage, resistance, and warrior spirit that made the Irish and Scots some of the most feared opponents in British history. Now let's begin. To understand why the British feared the Irish and Scots, we must travel back, before nations, before crowns. Ireland and Scotland were independent lands, ruled not by kings but by clans. Each clan had its own chief, its own code of honor, and its own fierce warriors. These weren't just villagers with tools. They were trained to fight, raised on stories of war and survival. They lived by loyalty, and they died for pride. When the English crown began to expand, it found itself face to face with a problem it couldn't solve: people who refused to kneel. The Irish and Scots didn't fear armies or flags. They feared losing who they were, and they would rather die than surrender that. The British crown quickly learned something it never forgot. These weren't ordinary enemies. These were rebels by birth. Men and women born to fight for their land, their clan, and their name. That kind of fire doesn't fade. It sparks wars, and it fuels fear for centuries. The Irish weren't just brave, they were unpredictable. Unlike traditional European armies, the Irish fought like shadows. When the English first tried to invade in the 12th century, they thought they'd win easily. But what they found was chaos. The Irish didn't line up in open fields. They hid in the woods. They struck from the bogs. They attacked at night. They ambushed from cliffs. Their knowledge of the land made them deadly. British soldiers called it madness. The Irish called it home field advantage. While England had knights and castles, Ireland had warriors who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. Spears, slings, ambushes, and silence. That was the Irish method. 1 minute, a patrol was marching through a forest. The next, nothing but bodies and blood. Even when outnumbered and outarmed, the Irish refused to retreat. The British were used to wars of rules, but the Irish played by instinct, and that made them terrifying, because you can fight an army. But how do you fight people who seem to vanish into the land itself? But the true battle went beyond swords and ambushes. It reached deep into the soul of a people. To the British, conquering Ireland wasn't just about land, it was about identity. And that's where they failed. The Irish didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with culture. Their language was ancient and poetic, their music stirred rebellion, their stories kept heroes alive long after they died. British rulers knew that to truly control Ireland, they had to erase this culture. So they tried. Speaking Irish was banned, traditional clothing outlawed, Irish music was silenced, schools were forced to teach English. But instead of disappearing, Gaelic culture went underground. Psalms were whispered, stories were shared in secret, children were taught their roots in the dark corners of cottages and churches. Every law passed to crush Irish identity only made it grow stronger. Because when a culture is attacked, it learns to survive. It becomes sharper, stronger, and more unified. The British feared this deeply, not just because it was defiance, but because it was lasting. Swords can be broken, armies can be scattered, but a culture carried in the heart, that's a weapon that never dulls. Now let's talk about the Scots. To the British, the Scots were something entirely different. They weren't just warriors, they were war itself. Especially in the Highlands, where clan life thrived. These men weren't armored soldiers. They were barefoot hunters who could run across frozen rock without flinching. They wielded broadswords taller than most men. They wore kilts not for fashion, but for movement. Speed mattered more than steel. And they didn't fear pain or death. Stories spread across the British Isles about clans that would charge downhill into English lines, screaming like banshees, overwhelming trained regiments in minutes. British generals didn't know how to fight this. The terrain was unforgiving. The weather brutal. The people relentless. No matter how many soldiers they sent, the Highlanders came back stronger, bolder. And even when clans were rivals, they united when threatened. The British feared this unity because when the Highlanders marched together, no empire could sleep easy. Scotland wasn't just a place, it was a threat, one always waiting to rise again from the mist. And behind that rising mist stood a legend, one man who became the face of fearless defiance. His name was William Wallace. He wasn't a king, he wasn't rich, he wasn't even expected to lead. But when the English tried to dominate Scotland in the 13th century, Wallace did something no one saw coming. He stood up. With a ragtag army of farmers and villagers, he defeated the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Outnumbered, outarmed, but never outwilled. Wallace showed that courage, not bloodline, could lead a nation. His rebellion shook the throne. So much so that when he was finally captured, he was executed in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. Drawn, quartered, humiliated. But even in death, Wallace became a weapon. His story was passed on, his bravery immortalized. He became the nightmare every British ruler hoped to avoid, a symbol of fearless freedom. Wallace wasn't just a man, he was a message. That one soul, burning bright with belief, could defy an empire. And that idea terrified them. After Wallace, the Highlands remained a stronghold of defiance. The British called them remote. But what they truly meant was untouchable. The Highland clans didn't answer to kings and castles. They followed their own codes, handed down through generations. In those steep mountains and misty glens, the law of the land was clan loyalty. British officers knew it well. Step into the Highlands without numbers, and you risked disappearing. One wrong move, one insult, and a single clan could rise up and wipe out your regiment. The terrain worked in the clan's favor. Hidden passes, narrow trails, ambush points everywhere. They attacked from above, disappeared into the rocks, and struck again before help arrived. The British weren't just fighting geography, they were fighting generations of pride, vengeance, and honor. The Highlands weren't dangerous because they were wild. They were dangerous because the spirit of rebellion never left them. Every valley whispered stories of freedom. And every clan held a memory the British Empire could never erase. That memory, that unbroken fire in the Highlands, would soon ignite a movement that threatened the very core of the British monarchy. The Jacobite rebellions terrified Britain, not just because they were armed revolts, but because they carried a vision. The Jacobites weren't just fighting to change a king, they were fighting to change the future. The Stuart line promised a different Britain, one that threatened the balance of power. And when Bonnie Prince Charlie raised his standard in 1745, the Highlands answered. Thousands of clansmen marched, fueled by faith and fury. They pushed south fast, too fast. By the time they reached Derby, London trembled. What if they kept going? What if the crown fell? The British struck back with brutal force. At Culldan, the Jacobite dream was crushed, but punishment came harder than the battle. Highland life was dismantled. Kilts were outlawed. Clan chiefs were executed. The Gaelic language was targeted. It wasn't just about stopping a rebellion, it was about destroying a way of life. The British knew something vital. If you don't break the spirit of a people, they'll rise again. That fear shaped policy for generations. If there's one thing that defined Ireland under British rule, it was relentless resistance. The British might crush a rebellion, but soon enough, another would rise. In 1798, inspired by global revolutions, the Irish launched a major uprising. It failed, but it sent a clear message. The fire wasn't out. In the decades that followed, the British faced attack after attack. Secret societies like the Fenian Brotherhood and the Irish Republican Brotherhood kept the dream of independence alive in whispers and gunfire. The 1916 Easter Rising took it further, transforming Dublin into a battleground. Though it was defeated, the public mood changed. Britain saw something deeper than rebellion. These weren't random uprisings. They were the heartbeat of a people who refused to be silenced. Every crackdown made them louder. Every execution made them stronger. Britain came to realize a hard truth. It wasn't just Ireland's land they couldn't hold. It was her spirit. Because the Irish didn't fear defeat. They feared forgetting who they were. By 1919, Ireland's fight transformed from rebellion to revolution. The Irish Republican Army, formed from veterans of the 1916 Rising, didn't wear uniforms. They blended in, shopkeepers by day, soldiers by night. They used their knowledge of towns and terrain to strike suddenly and vanish. British forces trained for open battlefields struggled in this new kind of war. Streets became war zones. Police barracks were bombed. Ambushes became routine. For every move the British made, the IRA had a silent counter. It wasn't just warfare, it was psychological. Britain realized it was being beaten not by a nation's army, but by a nation's will. In 1921, the war ended in negotiation. Ireland was free, though not whole. The North remained under British control. But in the South, the flag of an Irish republic was raised. The message to Britain was clear. You can rule a people with guns and chains, for a time. But once that people finds its voice, no empire on earth can silence it. Let's now turn our attention to the Scots and take a closer look at their fierce legacy. Scotland's greatest rebellion after Culldan wasn't fought with swords, but with memory. After the Highland clearances and the banning of clan traditions, British authorities believed they had tamed the Scots. But the Scottish people resisted in a quieter, deeper way. They refused to forget. Gaelic continued to be whispered in homes. Songs of Wallace and Bruce were still sung in hidden gatherings. Family stories of resistance were passed down like sacred scripture. When political power failed, culture stepped in. And over time, that culture stirred something new. In the 20th century, movements for Scottish autonomy began to grow. It wasn't about hatred, it was about healing. The Scottish Parliament was restored in 1999 after nearly 300 years, and still, the dream of full independence lives on in many hearts. Britain fears that flame because it never fully went out. Scotland remains proud, rooted, and ready. Because when a people protect their stories, their land, and their name, they never truly fall. And just as Scotland's memory kept its rebellion alive, Ireland's unresolved wounds reopened, with fire, fury, and the return of modern war. The Troubles weren't ancient history. They were Britain's modern nightmare. From the late 1960s through the 1990s, Northern Ireland erupted. What began as civil rights protests quickly spiraled into bloodshed. The lines were drawn. Catholics versus Protestants, Irish nationalists versus British loyalists. In the shadows, the IRA returned, not as rural rebels but as urban guerrillas. They planted bombs, ambushed patrols, and turned cities into front lines. Belfast and Derry became daily war zones. Even London felt the shockwaves. Soldiers walked streets in fear. Civilians lived under constant surveillance. Sniper fire, riots, explosions. Fear was everywhere. It wasn't a distant colony in rebellion. This was home turf. The British government realized they weren't just losing control, they were losing trust. Over 3,500 lives were lost before the 1998 Good Friday Agreement brought a fragile peace. But the message was loud. Unity can't be demanded at gunpoint. The Troubles reminded Britain that unresolved identity, history, and injustice don't fade with time. They explode when ignored. Now let's look beyond the battles, to the deeper fear that haunted the British Empire. What terrified Britain wasn't just rebellion, it was resistance that couldn't be tamed. The Irish and Scots didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with ideas. They refused to forget where they came from. Their languages, songs, and pride couldn't be erased by force. That made them dangerous, not just at home, but abroad. The Irish and Scots became proof that empires could be defied, even without massive armies. Their courage echoed across continents. And to the British, that was a different kind of threat. It wasn't about guns, it was about contagion, the idea that resistance could spread. The Irish and Scots didn't just fight back, they lit a spark in the global struggle for freedom. Their example said, even if you're small, poor, and outnumbered, you can still shake an empire. That idea couldn't be silenced, and it terrified the crown more than any army ever could. The Irish and Scots were hard to defeat not because of power, but because of purpose. Their strength was generational. In every family, stories of rebellion were passed down like sacred scripture. Grandfathers told tales of defiance. Mothers taught children the songs of freedom. Every child knew their history, not the one written by empires, but the one carved into the land. That made every village a battlefield, every home a fortress. The British could never fully conquer the people, because they didn't just live in territory, they lived in tradition. Their warrior spirit wasn't about fighting for wealth, it was about fighting for identity, honor, and survival. They didn't need armies, they needed memory. And that memory, made them fearless. Empires can train soldiers, but they cannot create soul. That's what made the Irish and Scots unstoppable. Because when resistance lives in the blood, when every corner of your culture says never surrender, you become more than a fighter, you become unbreakable. And that unbreakable spirit didn't die. It became legend. The British Empire has faded, but the legacy of fear still lingers in its shadow. Ireland is free, Scotland remains part of the UK, but the push for independence is stronger than ever. Across generations, the stories of defiance never stopped. They echo in ballads, books, and films. In public speeches and family whispers, Wallace and Bruce, Wolfe and Connolly, these names still carry weight because they remind people what's possible when courage outweighs conquest. British leaders may not speak of fear today, but history tells the truth. They were never more afraid than when rebellion rose from within, not from a foreign land, but from the people they tried hardest to suppress. And the fiercest resistance didn't come from distant shores. It came from the rugged hills of the Highlands and the misty fields of Ireland. That's the legacy, not just of war, but of survival, pride, and memory. And even today, the flame hasn't gone out. It still burns, in songs, in hearts, and in dreams of freedom. As we come to the end of this journey through centuries of resistance, rebellion, and courage, one thing becomes clear. The British didn't just fear the weapons of the Irish and Scots, they feared their will. They feared a people who wouldn't kneel, who wouldn't forget their past, who wouldn't stop fighting for their future. From the foggy highlands of Scotland to the green fields of Ireland, these proud nations showed the world something powerful. You don't need to be an empire to change history. You just need the heart to stand your ground. And that heart, the warrior spirit of the Irish and Scots, still beats loudly today. So here's a question for you. Do you think the world has lost that spirit of fearless resistance? Or is it just waiting to rise again? Let us know in the comments below. If this story opened your eyes to a powerful part of history, hit the like button. Subscribe for more bold stories the world tried to forget. Share your thoughts below, whether you're Irish, Scottish, or just someone who believes in the power of standing up. Because history doesn't belong to the victors. It belongs to the brave. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.